A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
What were the dates of those footprints?
I work for the Bureau of Land Management in Burns District. I've been the district archaeologist here for 21 years.
For most of the last century, the story of the first Americans had a clean beginning, a fixed date, and a single doorway. Humans, we were told, crossed from Siberia into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, slipped through a narrow gap between two continent-sized ice sheets, and spread across a virgin landscape no person had ever touched. It was tidy. It was teachable. And in the high desert of eastern Oregon, it turned out to be wrong. The place that broke the story open isn't dramatic to look at. It's a shallow overhang cut into a low ridge of rock, roughly 10 feet deep and 60 feet long, sitting in a stretch of sagebrush and dust called Rimrock Draw, not far from the small town of Riley. There's no ocean view, no dramatic canyon, nothing that looks like it belongs on the cover of a magazine. For decades, that plainness was exactly why nobody bothered to dig there. The interior of Oregon during the Ice Age was written off as a dead zone, too far from the coast, too locked in ice and cold, too marginal to have supported the earliest arrivals. If people showed up anywhere in this region, the thinking went, it would have been thousands of years after the glaciers finally let go. Nobody expected Rimrock Draw to argue back. The team that opened up this site wasn't hunting for evidence of the first Americans. Archaeologists from the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, working under an agreement with the Bureau of Land Management, began excavating there in 2011 with a much narrower goal: to understand how Ice Age animals had used the shelter and how the local environment had shifted over thousands of years. It was meant to be a study of bones and climate, not a study of people. What they found instead was a stack of sediment that behaved almost too well. In a typical open-air shelter, the ground turns into a mess over time. Roots push through it. Burrowing animals churn it. Rainwater drags material from higher layers down into lower ones, blurring any sense of what came before what. At Rimrock Draw, that chaos never really set in. The layers held their shape, distinct bands of sediment stacked in sequence, largely undisturbed by the intrusions that usually scramble a site's history. For an archaeologist, a sequence like that is close to a gift. It means whatever gets discovered, and at whatever depth, can be trusted to reflect the actual order in which it was buried. Nothing had crept up. Nothing had sunk down. Depth meant age, plainly and reliably. Stone tools started showing up almost as soon as digging began, not rocks that had simply cracked apart on their own, but pieces with intentional edges, shaped by someone who understood how to strike stone in a way that would produce a useful cutting or scraping surface. And they weren't confined to one level. They turned up again and again through multiple layers, separated by long gaps of sediment that represented centuries or more with no sign of activity at all. That pattern told its own story. This wasn't a place people wandered into once by accident. It was a location they came back to generation after generation, long enough that returning to Rimrock Draw had apparently become part of how people organized their lives on this landscape. The real turning point came from something far less glamorous than a spear point, a scatter of tooth fragments. In 2012, digging beneath a distinct band of pale volcanic ash, the team uncovered fragments of teeth belonging to two Ice Age animals that no longer exist anywhere on Earth: an extinct camel of the genus Camelops, an extinct species of giant bison, Bison antiquus, notably larger than the bison that still roam North America today. Finding the remains of vanished megafauna wasn't itself shocking. Pleistocene bone turns up in the American West with some regularity. What made this find different was the ash sealing it in place. That ash layer could be tied to a documented eruption of Mount St. Helens, one the geologists had already dated to roughly 15,000 to 15,600 years before the present. Volcanic ash is one of the most reliable timestamps in archaeology. It falls quickly, blankets a wide area almost simultaneously, and settles into a single, recognizable layer. Anything found underneath an intact ash layer has to predate the eruption that produced it. There's no plausible way for it to be younger. At Rimrock Draw, that ash band was clean and undisturbed, which meant the bones beneath it were locked to a floor date older than the eruption itself. Then came confirmation that people had actually handled these animals. Alongside the bones, researchers recovered two carefully shaped stone scrapers, made from orange agate and chalcedony, materials that don't occur naturally anywhere near the site, meaning the stone had been carried in from elsewhere, whether by long-distance travel or exchange with other groups. One of those scrapers, recovered in 2012, still carried a residue that laboratory testing identified as blood protein from Bison antiquus, direct biochemical evidence that the tool had been used to process that specific extinct animal. A second scraper turned up in 2015, buried even deeper in the sediment, below both the ash layer and the animal teeth. That positioning mattered enormously. Because the sediment at Rimrock Draw had remained so undisturbed, its layering could be read almost like the pages of a book. Deeper always meant older, without exception. A tool resting beneath the ash and beneath the dated teeth had to be older than both. Belief in a discovery this significant couldn't rest on stratigraphy and stone alone. It needed a hard number, and it needed that number to hold up under repeated scrutiny. Researchers sent samples of the tooth enamel to two independent specialists, Dr. Thomas Stafford of Stafford Research and Dr. John Southen of the University of California, Irvine. Radiocarbon dating of tooth enamel is a slow, exacting process, and O'Grady's team didn't stop at a single test. They ran the analysis in 2018, and then again in 2023, specifically to see whether the results would hold. They did. Both rounds converged on the same figure, roughly 18,250 years before the present. That number is difficult to overstate. It places direct, tool-marked evidence of human activity in interior Oregon more than 5,000 years before the earliest date the old, ice-free corridor model could even theoretically allow. At 18,250 years ago, the corridor at the heart of that model didn't exist yet. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, the two continental glaciers whose eventual separation was supposed to open a walkable path south from Alaska, were still fused together, sealing off the interior of the continent. If people were already living in Central Oregon at that time, they could not have gotten there by walking down a corridor that hadn't opened. That leaves only one geographically coherent explanation: migration along the Pacific coastline itself. Even at the height of the last glacial maximum, researchers argue, the shoreline retained pockets of open, resource-rich habitat, kelp forests and coastal ecosystems capable of supporting people moving southward by boat well ahead of any interior corridor. Rimrock Draw doesn't sit on the coast, so its evidence doesn't prove that route directly. But it does something almost as important. It rules out the interior route as it existed at 18,250 years ago, which means whoever left tools and butchered bison at this rock shelter must have found another way in and gotten there early enough and in strong enough numbers to be pushing inland from wherever their point of entry was. The oldest confirmed date at Rimrock Draw, 18,250 years, is not necessarily the oldest thing in the ground. It's simply the oldest thing that has been dated and dug out so far. Beneath the layer containing the dated camel and bison teeth, excavators have found additional stone fragments and subtler traces suggestive of human presence, in sediment that has not yet been fully analyzed. Because the site's stratigraphy has proven so reliable elsewhere, there's little reason to distrust what it implies here. Material sitting below an 18,250-year-old layer in undisturbed sediment would have to be older still. Nobody has put a confirmed number on those deeper traces. Excavation hasn't reached the base of the shelter, and limited funding, along with the need to preserve what remains for future, more advanced testing methods, has kept the deepest layers only partially explored. That's an uncomfortable kind of open question for a field that likes firm dates, but it's also the honest state of the evidence. The most defensible claim right now is the one anchored by two independent labs and two separate rounds of testing. People were processing large Ice Age animals at this shelter at least 18,250 years ago. Anything older is a strong possibility supported by the site's own internal logic, not yet a proven fact. For the better part of 100 years, the framework known as Clovis first set the outer boundary of how old any claim about the first Americans was allowed to be. It held that people entered the continent only after roughly 13,000 years ago, following the retreat of the ice sheets and the opening of that interior corridor, and that essentially everything before that point was either misdated, misidentified, or simply impossible. Rimrock Draw isn't the site that started dismantling that model. Other locations, from coastal Chile to the American Southeast, had already chipped away at it over the preceding few decades. But it adds something the model can't easily wave away: a well-preserved, cleanly stratified interior site dated independently by two separate laboratories on two separate occasions, sitting more than 5,000 years earlier than the corridor it would have needed to use. The bones show clear evidence of deliberate processing. The tools carry biochemical residue, tying them directly to an extinct species. The dating has been repeated and has held. Taken together, that combination is hard to explain away as contamination, misidentification, or wishful interpretation. It fits a growing body of evidence gathered from sites scattered across 2 continents, all pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion for the old model. People were in the Americas thousands of years earlier than the ice-free corridor story allowed, and they most likely got here by moving along the coast, not through the continent's frozen interior. Perhaps the most striking part of the Rimrock Draw story isn't the age of the site, it's what the evidence says about the people who left it behind. These weren't disoriented survivors clinging to the margins of a hostile landscape. The stone tools recovered from the shelter show real craftsmanship, deliberate shaping, working edges suited to specific tasks, and were patterns consistent with sustained, repeated use rather than a single moment of desperate improvisation. The raw material itself, orange agate and chalcedony not native to the immediate area, had to be carried in, whether through direct travel to a distant outcrop or through exchange with neighboring groups. Either explanation implies planning, geographic knowledge, and some form of social network extending beyond a single small band. And the return visits matter just as much as the tools themselves. Stone artifacts appearing across multiple, separated layers of sediment tell us this shelter wasn't a one-time discovery. It was a known place, revisited across an enormous span of time, likely because people understood something about its value: shelter from wind and sun, proximity to water, or a reliable vantage point for tracking game. A stream ran near the site during its earliest occupation and continued flowing for thousands of years afterward, which may well be part of why this unassuming overhang kept drawing people back long after any single individual who first found it was gone. None of this fits comfortably with the old image of the first Americans as thin, struggling populations barely holding on at the edge of survival. It points instead to people with established routines, working knowledge of the terrain, and enough organization to maintain contact with groups beyond their immediate camp. Thriving, in other words, in a landscape that mainstream models insisted couldn't have supported anyone at all this early. If a site holding evidence this old could sit undisturbed and largely unexamined for decades before its true age came to light, the obvious question is what else has been missed. Regions dismissed for generations as too remote, too cold, or too marginal to matter are, by definition, the regions nobody has looked at carefully. Rimrock Draw suggests that dismissal itself may be the biggest obstacle standing between archaeologists and a genuinely accurate picture of how this continent was first settled. That has practical consequences for how digs get run going forward. A working assumption that the oldest material sits near the surface, with everything ancient long since exhausted in well-known layers, no longer holds up. At Rimrock Draw, the deepest and potentially oldest evidence is still sitting untouched, simply because reaching it responsibly takes time, funding, and the discipline not to rush past material that later dating technology might read far more precisely than today's tools allow. The bigger picture forming here isn't really about one rock shelter in Oregon's high desert. It's about how much of this continent's earliest human history has likely gone unnoticed simply because nobody expected to find it in these particular places: coastal overhangs, high desert shelters, and quiet volcanic landscapes that never fit the outline of where the first Americans were supposed to have been. Every one of those overlooked corners is a place where a discovery like this one could still be sitting, waiting on a research team willing to dig somewhere the old model already told them not to bother looking. Rimrock Draw doesn't close the question of when humans first reached North America. If anything, it reopens it and reminds us that the story we've told about the first Americans has always been provisional, built on the sites we happen to have found so far, rather than on the full and still largely buried record of everywhere they actually went.